has to be finished for a publicity campaign to really start? I mean, there's the timeline of a book getting accepted and then edited and published, but where in that timeline do you show up and start to do publicity for it?
So the very, very beginning of the process is we have seasonal launch meetings where our editors will present to us the books on their list for that year. So they'll kind of run through and give us all a little pitch about the books that they have coming forth. Usually by that time we have manuscripts for those books. So after those meetings, I'll, write down, oh, I really want to read X, Y, and Z. These ones pique my interest. Sometimes there aren't manuscripts at that point, and it's something they just bought or they're hustling to get ready. But that's really where things start for me because as said, I go look at the books that I really am interested in working on. I'll then to my boss request the titles that really stood out to me. And from there, they'll assign titles to us. They are very kind about trying to make sure you get as many as the books that you're dying to work on. But also, of course, there's sometimes you're like, oh, okay, I wonder why this is on my list. But that's where things begin for me. And that's usually about a year ahead. From there, once we have a manuscript, the big part of my job begins about 6 months out from a publication date. So that's when I usually will connect with the author and agent. We'll set up a call, sometimes an in-person meeting. These days, usually a Zoom, but that's when we'll connect and I'll kind of outline for them my goals for the book, where, I see this hitting. And the thing that I've kind of crafted over the years of my job is I'll also at that point ask the author, what is your like Big 10 wish list? What are the things that would really be meaningful to you? And sometimes, the answer is, oh, I want to be on the New York Times bestseller list. But more often than not, there will be things that surprise me, like an author who's like, oh, my parents read the Boston Globe every day. That's my number one. If I could get a review or interview or some kind of coverage in the Boston Globe. So I use that kind of wish list to craft my campaign and to make sure that in addition to doing, pitching the places that I know will get attention, I'm also catering to what the author really sees as a successful campaign. So from there, I start sending out my pitch emails to what we call long lead media. So that's print magazines and newspapers, any national TV or radio shows, because they book a little bit further out. From there, I kind of work on a rolling basis. So as we get closer to the actual publication date, I'll continue to pitch those long lead media contacts and start making bookings, but I'll also begin reaching out to what we call short lead media contacts, which is going to be your weekly magazines, online sites, things that don't need as much of a lead time to book up their press. And then that's also the period about 3 to 4 months out is when we start looking at events, whether that's virtual or in person, and start reaching out to bookstores to see where they have interest and confirming those. And that brings us up to Pub Day, which is usually when I tell the authors, a lot of times with publicity, it'll feel like for them, there's a lot of silence. And then all of a sudden, everything is happening during that pub week. That is very intentional. With publicity, we try to make sure that all of our media hits kind of go at once so that someone is, reading that Boston Globe review and then the next day they open People magazine and see a review. We want it to be something where you're seeing that book as much as possible once it's actually available to buy. And then that's, yeah, kind of the big picture of the process.
Yeah, it's very involved. Could you give us a couple of keys to like that you've noticed over the years to that help ensure like a successful campaign? What are some things that you absolutely need to get done in order for this to have the chance that you want it to?
So this question is so interesting because the answer is kind of ever changing. What used to be the magical secret sauce for a successful campaign 5 years ago is so different than what it is now. When I first entered publishing, a little over 10 years ago, if you had an author on NPR and a New York Times book review, you were golden. That would usually help secure, if you didn't make the New York Times bestseller list, at least really healthy sales. And since then, and since the media landscape has been changing so much over the past decade, there is not really a simple X, Y, and Z is going to make a success, which is why I personally have kind of started to morph what I see a successful campaign as. And again, that's somewhere where like that wish list that I ask authors for really helps out, because if to them, all they want is the New York Times bestseller list, that's not always something I can guarantee. Same with if they're like, oh, I want to be a Reese book club pick. And, we can pitch as hard as we can possibly go, but it's something we have really little control over. So I think that in the past couple of years, what I define as a successful campaign has changed a lot. And I think Nightbitch is kind of a perfect example of that. It was a book that came out during a really confusing period for book publicity. And I think that, I think of it as such a successful campaign. It's a title I'm really proud of and I think got to so many people, but, it wasn't a read with Jenna pick or, some of these other metrics that you would put as quote unquote success. So I think the answer to your question is kind of ever changing, unfortunately.
As a follow-up to just the campaigns themselves, I'm curious about how they're budgeted. Like I mean, what kinds of budgets are you working with? I mean, I know it probably depends, it varies book to book, but I am wondering like what does the money go into? Talking about the publicity campaign budget.
Yeah, so for publicity campaigns, the budget is primarily used for events and for travel. So that's something that's also been really interesting to watch. We used to kind of always say, the rule of thumb for when you have an author on tour is you kind of bank in your head like $1,000 per city. And that's going to cover their airfare or train there, their hotel, their meals, their kind of incidentals. And, even in the past, I'd say year or two, we now are shifting that to, okay, it actually might be like $2,000 per city when we're taking authors out these days, given, the different costs now to travel. So that we use the publicity budget almost predominantly for events, and how that gets chosen is not necessarily always up to us. Early on in that process, when we, request titles and we do get our assignments, that's when I'll relay to my boss, I think this book would do really great with a 4 to 6 city tour. Here's why I'm envisioning we go, the author's hometown. In the book, they write about St. Louis, so we've got to go there and can draw on that audience, and trying to kind of make an argument for where I think we'll have successful events and how many there should be. That then goes up the chain beyond my purview to our publisher, who, ultimately has the final say and what budgets we're going to get. But yeah, for publicity, the budget is all about book tours and travels, and that's where it goes totally.
What are some of the experiences that you've had that you've really cherished with working with authors? And feel free to talk about sometimes it works.
Yeah, so I'll say on the pros column, back when I was touring with authors a lot, I had so many great experiences. As said, I think for me, that's really where you get to see firsthand readers connecting with their authors, and it can be very emotional and special. I very early on in my career went on tour with Jenny Lawson, whose fan base is, she writes about her own mental health struggles and is very open. And so the people that show up to her events bring that same energy. And it's, I would go to an event with her and I think she would speak for maybe 30 minutes, maybe 45, but then it would be like 3 hours of people coming up to get their book signed. And often people would come up crying or having really emotional responses. And it is so special to see firsthand how touched people are by books and by getting to be with the author. So that's definitely a really great experience. And I also, over the years have developed really nice friendships with a lot of these authors. So traveling with them sometimes does get to feel like you're kind of traveling with a friend, which is great. Definitely not always the case. I won't gloss over. But yeah, so that's definitely a really special moment. I will say, in terms of kind of the con columns, there's, I do have a lot of sympathy that authors spend so much time writing this book and they put so much into it. And then it's kind of like they hand off their baby. And I think that handoff a lot of the times can be really difficult. So I definitely have had experiences with authors where they want to be a part of every step of the process. They want to see how I'm pitching the book. They'll ask to like read my pitches and go over it with a fine tooth comb. And that definitely can be challenging, especially because they're really close to that work. They want it to be described exactly how it is in their head. But when we write pitches and how I'm trying to sell a book to the media is usually going to be pretty different than how an author wants it to. When I'm sending a book to the media and I'm trying to pitch it to them, in my head, I'm thinking, okay, I want this to be in their beach read column, or I want this to be in their gifts for dad. And that may not always necessarily be how an author wants their book to be, envisioned. So there can definitely be some struggles there when authors want to, they want to be the publicist and the editor and the marketer and the salesperson for their book. So
I think that gives us a little bit of an opportunity to talk about the differences between uh, publicity, being a publicist, and being someone who's involved primarily with the marketing of the book. Now, I think it's probably easy for people to imagine that those things, have some degree of overlap, but I don't know that we know exactly what those degrees of overlap are or where they are just very different, if parallel, kind of like modes for people who are working in publishing.
yeah, so my anecdote to describe publicity versus marketing is we're both trying to get the book into People magazine, but I'm trying to get a review and marketing's trying to get an ad placement. So marketing deals with money. They they get to have a budget and they're going after, social media and advertising and, banners and things like that. So they work directly with a lot of the same media outlets that we're working with, but in a really different way. And publicity and marketing do work together. For instance, if I'm setting up a book tour, I need to keep marketing in the loop because they're going to create a graphic with all the details of the book tour that we can then post on social media, that the author can post on social media. So we work with them a lot. And also, there will be media outlets where if I arrange for an author to write a personal essay, the media outlet will then offer, instead of paying the author for that essay, to basically pay us in an advertisement for the book on their website. So there is kind of an overlap. Sometimes we do work with each other in these different ways to kind of make sure we're getting books into the right places and working with one another, but it is a really similar job at times. And often in my intro conversations with authors, I'll say to them, if you're ever not sure if something is for marketing or for publicity, just send it to both of us and we'll figure it out on our end, because it can be pretty complicated from that end.
I'm curious to know from your perspective, like how the status of the book review has perhaps changed over the 10 years that you've been working in publicity. What role does it have? And I mean, it feels like a very important thing from the outside, but I'm curious to hear you talk about it.
I think the impact of reviews has been really, really decreasing over the past few years, but it is still helpful in terms of the what we call pull quotes. So the quotes that we're able to get from those reviews. We do put those on book jackets, as you mentioned, but I also, if I get a book that has a, great review in the Washington Post, even if no one reads it, I'm going to pull out a 1 or 2 sentence quote from there and try to use that to get the author an interview on NPR or the Today Show. So they still have an effect. I just think it's a really different one than they used to.